Throughout the Bible, we hear of gods, written with a little g at the front. Are they real? That's the question of the century. The church has taught for so many decades that these little g gods were only made of stone and wood, covered in brass, silver, gold, fancy metals, but that they were completely and 100% inanimate. Is that the real story, or is there more to this? To discuss this on panel with me is one of my longtime heroes, and actually one of the men behind my own personal spiritual awakening a number of years ago. I'm going to get into that first. I want to say welcome to the program, Derek Gilbert. Finally, right? I have been teasing the Derek Gilbert episodes since the beginning of the Donna Howell Show. First of all, just to remind everybody, we're talking right now to the author of best-selling books, The Gates of Hell. Now, The Gates of Hell, that's your most recent title, right?
Yes, co-authored with my best friend, Sharon K. Gilbert.
Yes. I'm looking forward to having Sharon Gilbert on very soon. The Second Coming of Saturn, that is another title, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, and finally Bad Moon Rising, which what's funny is that I've actually read most of these, and your most recent one, Gates of Hell, I've read like 3 times. These are great books, folks. One of the specialties for Derek Gilbert is the fact that he can identify not only just what gods may have been real to certain people, how they operated in society, but you've also gone a step further than that to look at whether or not the gods were real, not specifically something in human imagination. And that's a very controversial approach to this topic, except it happens to be not only theologically permissible, but historically, that's the thing that makes the most sense in everything that we can see. Now, some of this is going to nudge a little bit close to the edge of before Genesis. You guys have heard me talk about the effects of these gods. I'm putting air quotes up, church. We're going to get to that in a minute. Bear with me. First, I just want to say, Derek, one of the reasons why I'm really excited to have you on is not just to hear the expertise that you have in this, but there was a number of years ago, as you very well remember, when we were first kind of starting the Skywatch thing. And my father had approached me and asked me to be a part of some of the more public ministries that we were doing at the time. And my answer had always been, no, never going to happen. I was really, really wanting to just be private and have my name off of, I didn't want my name or my face on anything. And wonderful thing about Tom Horn, he never one time pressured me to do anything I didn't want to do or that I didn't feel like I was supposed to do. But a lot of times he would continue to hear my heart on, Monday through Friday, he'd hear my heart. And Sunday I'd have, a big revolution of what I'm supposed to be doing for the Lord. What am I supposed to be doing for the Lord? And Dad continued to say, well, you've got an opportunity here to do some of these things. Are you sure you shouldn't be doing some of these things? Big, crisis going on, looking for my own identity, trying to establish a lot of things. And in the midst of all of this, you and your wife were sitting at the first office you had currently where we have our warehouse books. I came in and I asked if I could talk to you guys. My father was the first person I sought for wisdom and for direction. But in this particular case, I was like, where do I ask? I was really new to the area. I hadn't found a church yet. And I was like, who can I ask besides my father that would, be able to say, this is where life goes and here's life advice in general. And of course, I went to you and Sharon right after that. And it was great advice you guys gave me that day. It was just wonderful advice. And it just helped me kind of reflect and think about where I'm going and what I should be doing. And right after that, I found the Gilbert House Fellowship. Now, I cannot recommend highly enough the Gilbert House Fellowship online, the way that you and your wife break down what's going on in all of these different verses.
Give the Lord credit for that because, for somebody with my training and background, I guess I'm what you'd call an autodidact, just somebody with a curious mind who loves to read and learn. Sharon's the same way. And the Lord, through his wisdom, brought us together, even though we were living a couple hundred miles apart at the time. Her background in molecular biology, and before that as a professional vocalist like you, world class.
Thank you.
As a radio announcer, and then getting into sales as a way of taking my only marketable skills, which is using a computer and talking a lot. So directing that in a way that can be useful. So, if we offered you anything good, it comes from the Lord because I don't know that I have any innate store of wisdom that I can pass along. So, that's all him.
Yeah, well, the Gilbert House Fellowship was a spiritual awakening starter for me. And I'm just letting you know out there, you guys have heard me say this a million times. I'm going to say it again. We are headed for a great awakening. You can only take so much demoralization, depravity, all the headlines. People are divided. The world is completely bipolar against itself at all times. You can only take that for so long, as history does tell. You either get to the book of Revelation, which I want to believe we're not quite there yet, or you hit a great awakening. It's the cyclical cycle of man. You get on your knees when you get desperate, and the world is desperate. So, what are we heading for? I want to think good times. And the Gilbert House Fellowship is what completely awakened me, because it was like the deepest dive, the most unbelievable theology. You guys at home, check it out, gilberthouse.org. I absolutely loved being a part of that church. I'm still a part of that church. I still check out your episodes.
Yeah, it's been education for us too, because it's really informed the writing that we've done. And, credit where it's due. Dr. Michael Heiser has been a great influence, I know, on you, on us, on your father, and many of our friends as well. His book, The Unseen Realm, opened up the Bible to us in a way that we'd not seen before. You mentioned the little g gods in your opening, and that was a key part of Mike's research into the divine council, which is sort of like the court of the king. We look at God as the high king, and he's got a court that he has created of supernatural beings. The simple term would be angels. That's not quite precise enough, but it works. Of these angelic beings who carry out his will. Some of them, because they were created with free will, just as we humans have been, decided to choose badly and rebelled against him. What I think is surprising now, but again, back in the day when I was being raised up in church, taught by pastors who had your typical seminary educations, that the small g gods mentioned in the Bible were these idols of wood and stone. They were the imaginary friends of the pagans around ancient Israel. It is a very simplistic, it's almost like a flannel board. You remember in Sunday school, a little flannel board, Noah with the cute little beard and the cute little animals. Flannel board understanding of the supernatural war in which all of us are deployed. And so we don't understand why things are happening. Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, because you've got these supernatural entities who've chosen to rebel against the creator. And we are the pawns in this war. And we're on the battlefield. We're being shot at, in a manner of speaking, supernaturally speaking. So God will sometimes allow the enemy to get at us for our own education. There are lessons to be learned through suffering. I think Mike Heiser, again, is a wonderful example of that. As you know, he endured 18 months of pancreatic cancer, but he worked right up until the end. And some of those last videos of Mike, he's just painfully thin, but he is still as sharp as ever. Well, Mike's research, especially prompted by Psalm 82, which is where God takes his place in the divine council in the midst of the gods, Elohim in the midst of Elohim. Clearly, he's not in the midst of himself. So, who are these gods that he's in the midst of? That is kind of an eye opener. And then, especially when he passes judgment on these, though you are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High, like men, you shall die. This is like a courtroom scene in heaven. God passing sentence on these entities. Then, when you start pulling on those threads and digging into it, and this is what Sharon and I have been doing ever since we started the weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship, back in 2014. And having known Mike since about 2005, our first interview with him was in the fall of 2005, when his book was still just an idea. We try to apply that understanding of the spiritual realm, which was the understanding of the Hebrew prophets, the understanding of the apostles, to what we're reading each week. And that really just makes the Bible come alive. Suddenly it's gone from flannel board to three-dimensional Technicolor. There is a war taking place. The Hebrew prophets knew it. They knew that the gods of their pagan neighbors were a part of this war. And a lot of what we read in scripture is polemic. It's in response to what their neighbors believed. We can get a better understanding of some of the more difficult sections of scripture when we understand that this is what's going on. There are a lot of people who rejected the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in various ways, saying, no, this can't be real, or I can't believe in a God who would allow his people or direct his people to do this. For example, commanding Joshua to declare the Amorites of Canaan, Harem, meaning under the ban, dedicated to destruction or devoted to destruction, because they were sold out to these fallen entities. If you read Leviticus chapter 18, and pro tip, don't read it out loud with kids in the room. These are the things that the Amorites of Canaan were doing that God found reprehensible. And I won't go into it here because it's really lewd, crude, and disgusting. This is why God was pushing them out of the land. And because those people had sold themselves out to these entities who required this of them, this kind of bloodletting and physical interactions that are forbidden under the law, but also forbidden under modern society. God said they just are irredeemable. But even having said that, there are Amorites in Jesus' bloodline. For example, Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho. The Moabite is in Jesus' bloodline, and the Moabites followed a god. Their national god, Chemosh, required child sacrifice. We see that in the story of Jehoshaphat and his war against King Mesha, who sacrificed his son on the wall of his capital city. These are the kinds of things that were going on in the ancient world that these small g gods required. Think of them as fallen angels if you don't like the word God. But I think that's really a hang up that we English speakers have connected to that word, because God, capital G God, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, calls them gods. And so if we have a problem with that word, we need to take it up with the author of the book.
That's actually where I would like to also go next, because I know that there's probably a lot of people listening. Actually, it's probably about a 50-50 split. There's probably a lot of Skywatch people who have been following us for a while that are sitting here going, yeah, preach it, Derek. Finally, somebody's bringing this to the attention of everybody. There might be some people that have just caught on and they're just hearing this for the first time. Backing up to the very beginning of Unseen Realm, I remember how Dr. Michael Heiser describes his earlier struggles in finding this for the first time. And he's sitting there going, I couldn't believe I had seen it. I'm looking at the Hebrew. Here he is. He's fluent in biblical Hebrew, not just biblical Hebrew, but also some of the dialects that have been rendered completely obsolete, that are no longer even spoken in the world anymore, that there's only a few handful of scholars that are completely fluent in these languages. And Michael Heiser was one of them. And he's looking at this, the sons of God. He's looking at the Elohim, plural, being described in Psalms of the divine council. And he's going, I can't not see that ever again. And it completely changed his entire life, his entire career. Everything went, wait a minute. If God is talking to the gods and he's calling them gods, and we have to take the Bible for what it says, not what we want to interpret through the ancient church fathers, not what makes us most comfortable, not what Plato did and then what Augustine did, which we can get into. I would love for you to break that down. When Mike Heiser got to this moment, he said, we have to read the Bible for what it says.
Yeah.
And it says gods, and it's talking about them in context as if they are real and they are in the presence of God right now being reprimanded. We cannot in any way, shape, or form see humans in this passage, which a lot of people do. God called them gods. He used the word Elohim. We've got to let the Bible say what the Bible actually says. So what would you say? Well, obviously, let's start here. What would you say if a person came to you and said, Derek, but what about all of these other times? I mean, isn't it humans we're talking about?
I've given a talk on this a number of times, giants in the Bible and why they matter. And this is part of that discussion. The phrase B'nai Elohim or B'nai Elim or B'nai Ha-Elohim always refers to supernatural beings. Elohim is a word that means a denizen of the spirit realm. Okay, a spirit. The spirit of the prophet Samuel, who returns to deliver a message from God to King Saul the night before Saul dies in battle with the Philistines. The medium of Endor. She sees him emerging from the earth and she calls him an Elohim. Now, that doesn't mean that Samuel is now suddenly part of the pantheon of pagan gods.
Right.
No, it just means he's a spirit occupying a place in the spirit realm. I am a Chicagoan because I was born there. That's basically it. That's, people who live in Chicago are Chicagoans, but that's not necessarily their ontological essence. That's not who they are. I am
right.
German, Swedish, Welsh, English, and so on. That, I think, is how we need to think of that word God when we see it in the Bible. But yes, there are a number of references in Scripture that make it clear that these entities are not the imaginary friends of the pagans. Why would God himself in Exodus 12:12 tell Moses on the night of the Passover, when the destroying angel, goes through the land and takes the life of the firstborn, he would also execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt? Why would you mention it? How would that glorify God to say, I'm going to destroy all their carvings?
All their little pieces of wood. Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. We as Christians need to step back and analyze our assumptions about what we believe. I think most of us, although that may be a dangerous statement based on the research of George Barna at Arizona Christian University, whose worldview survey finds that most American Christians don't actually believe Satan is a literal entity.
Okay.
Okay, that's Christianity 101. Satan is a literal entity, not a concept or an idea. A large percentage of American Christians don't take Satan literally. But assuming that you do, why then is it such a stretch to imagine that there are other entities in the spirit realm who, like Satan, have set themselves up as deities? When Paul refers to false doctrines, he literally calls them doctrines of demons. He wasn't being allegorical. He wasn't, using figurative language. The pagans were worshiping demons, and that their religious doctrines were being handed to them by these fallen entities. It's not that big a stretch from what we think we know as Christians if we accept that Satan is a literal entity who is opposed to God. It's just that he's not the only one. There are a whole bunch of them out there. And God called them out, Psalm 82, and said, hey, you're going to die. But even more than that, there's a group that existed and transgressed before the flood of Noah. And we know this from Peter and from Jude, 2 Peter 2, verse 4. God did not spare the angels when they sinned. Angels, angelos in Greek being the closest Greek term for Elohim. He didn't spare them when they sinned, but thrust them down to hell, is what our English Bibles say. But the word in Greek is Tartarus. Well, we know in Greek mythology, there's a group of old gods who were thrust down to Tartarus. Those are the Titans of Greek mythology. Kronos and his bunch were overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians and pushed down to Tartarus. I argue in the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, that story, the Greeks and the Romans taught, where it's, Jupiter overthrowing Saturn and his bunch, it's actually based on an older Mesopotamian story. The Hurrians, who are an ancient people that we can trace back to the plains of Ararat, actually, below where Noah's Ark came to rest. They have the oldest version of that story, where their version of Kronos or Saturn is called Kumarbi, and their version of Zeus and Jupiter is named Teshub, and it's the same story. The storm god, who emerges as the king of the pantheon, overthrows old dad and casts him down to the netherworld, where he's confined forever. Well, the Bible tells us the real version of that story. The angels who sinned, but in 2 Peter 2 and in Jude verses 6 and following, it's clear that it's a sexual sin, which points to Genesis chapter 6 and the sons of God, those B'nai Ha Elohim, not the righteous sons of Seth.
Oh my goodness.
Sons of God, angelic beings, if you will, but Elohim, created with free will, who transgressed and committed a really egregious sin in a couple of ways. For one, transgressing against the boundary between species, because we are not them and they are not us. It's like some of the stuff in Leviticus 18 God told the Israelites not to do. I think it was an attempt to try to take dominion of earth away from the children of Adam and Eve. Hey, we will corrupt the bloodline, we'll create this hybrid army to destroy humanity, and they will serve us, and we will take dominion of this beautiful planet that God created. That's why God sent the flood of Noah and destroyed these entities. Again, when you understand that's what's going on here, this supernatural war, things like the flood of, why would God kill everybody?
Right.
The flood?
Oh, because they were really mean always, Derek. I'm sorry, I had to.
Yeah,
No,
yes.
only evil always. And actually, you might be able to speak to this, but of course, I have looked at the number of times where it referred to Noah as being the only righteous man, the only one perfect in his generation. And of course, perfect in his generations by itself, it could, in English, sound like a moral perfection. But once you look at the context of the word perfect and then the context of in his generations, and you look at what's happening generationally as described in Genesis 6, you've got now a generational problem occurring, all related to when the sons of God, the B'nai Ha Elohim, which, as you said, does not ever refer to a human entity or group of entities, that when they came and they took daughters of the Israelites unto themselves, and they created an offspring that then became the men of renown, the mighty men, the men of renown. Breaking that down, think Hercules. If you want to speak in the absolute most layman's terms that anybody, even a child, could understand,
Right.
we see Hercules. He's big, he's strong, he's a demigod, he does all these whatever. Where did that come from? If there's any chance that that was ever real, or did everybody in the ancient world also take the same crazy pills, thousands of miles apart from each other. As far back as the Fertile Crescent, we've got these stories.
Right.
I mean, humanity begins and we have stories of gods and demigods. And of course, if you look at the mighty men of renown, the men of old, these are in common language, these were the big dogs that were known for the big things, the gods, the people who were in charge of, very mighty in all these different ways. So you do have an offspring here. Now Noah is perfect in his generations. The word generations, even in English, without even having to parse the Hebrew and argue about whether or not perfection meant moral or something else, even just in the English, in his generations, you see that this is a generational context. Now, add to that the fact that the Hebrew word here that is referring to his perfection cannot mean a moral perfection. Have we ever known of any human being that was ever morally perfect other than Jesus Christ himself? So no, it's not a moral perfection, and it couldn't be. And we also know that Noah sinned. We saw that in his drinking episode. There was no such thing as a moral perfection. So what kind of perfection could the Hebrew word means? Well, one of the main things that word means is undefiled, uncontaminated. And so whatever everything else was now represented a DNA counterfeit of God's original design. So Noah was something that God created, and pretty much nothing else was at this point because the world had corrupted itself, following the ways of the mighty men of old and the men of renown.
What's interesting is when you read in the writings of the early church fathers regarding the origin of demons, it was understood by earliest church theologians up until the time of Augustine in the early 5th century that demons were the spirits of the giants who had destroyed in the flood of Noah. But beyond that, they write, and I'm talking about guys like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and Athenagoras and Origen and somebody named Pseudo Clement. It wasn't the actual Clement of Rome, who was like a successor to Peter as far as the Bishop of Rome. But they understood that generation of angelic being prior to the flood had been delegated responsibility to come to earth and try to protect humanity and shepherd us following the fall in the garden. Okay, we need to protect these humans from the wiles of Satan who deceived Adam and Eve. And they decided that they would transgress because they were tempted by the daughters of man. The Bible tells us they saw that the daughters of man were attractive. And that led to sort of a mutual corruption. In the book of First Enoch, it's even hinted and implied that women would use some of the skills that they've been taught by Azazel or Azazel or Azael, depending on your translation, to adorn themselves and then tempt the angels into, because perhaps they were getting knowledge or information or something. There was some sort of transaction taking place. It's not explicit, it's implied. But this seemed to be the mission of that generation of angelic beings called Watchers in the book of First Enoch, who descended to the summit of Mount Hermon and said, okay, let's do this thing. Let's corrupt humanity. So there's a sense there that perhaps there was some sort of transactional thing going on there. Like, for example, Azazel, is mentioned in the book of First Enoch as teaching humans the art of adornment and making jewelry and things for the art of seduction. Mm-hmm. And so that women may have, and by extension, their husbands or fathers may have been using them to lure the supernatural beings into sin. But the bottom line is that God saw this as an existential threat to humanity, chose Noah because he was undefiled, uncorrupted, uncontaminated in his genetic line, and repopulated the earth from that 8 people who were on board the ark. The question is then what happened afterwards? Well, it appears that, and again, this is something that Dr. Michael Heiser has taught, what he calls the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Mm-hmm. Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, when God gave the nations their inheritance, and this is at Babel, of course, where he divided the nations by confusing languages after the Tower of Babel incident. He numbered the nations according to the number of the sons of God. There is a tradition amongst the Canaanites that their father god, El, who was the father of Baal and the other Canaanite deities, would rule the world from the summit of Mount Hermon with his consort Asherah. We read about the Asherah poles in the Old Testament, which was some sort of fertility thing, and their 70 sons. In the ancient Near East, that number 70 did not mean 7 times 10. It was a symbol that meant all of them.
The complete set.
The complete right.
Set. Mm-hmm.
So when you go to the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, you see that the descendants of Noah number exactly 70. And so the assumption is that God sent 70 angelic beings
down to earth to supervise humanity, except for Jacob, for Abraham, that he called for himself, and then through Isaac, Jacob became God's own nation. All the other nations are under the control of these other entities. Whether it's 70 or 200 or 1,000, we don't know, because the number 70 just represents all of them. The point is that God said, okay, the rest of the world, you don't want to deal with me. This was the point of the Tower of Babel incident. They were building an artificial mountain because mountains in the ancient world were understood to be the point of contact between humans and the spirit realm. You want to build an artificial mountain to make contact or reestablish contact with the old gods who have now gone away because they're in Tartarus. Fine, I'll give you what you want, but you're not going to be happy about it. In the same way that God told the prophet Samuel to anoint the tallest guy he could find. Saul was a head taller than everybody else, according to the Old Testament. So he anointed Saul to give Israel a king because the Israelites wanted a king so they could be like all the other nations. All right.
Okay.
God told Samuel, all right, give them what they want, but it's not going to be a reward, it's a punishment. In the same way, God telling humanity at Babel, all right, you don't want to deal with me, you'll deal with my subordinates, but you're not going to like it. This will be, and we see this confirmed in Deuteronomy 4, verses 19 and 20, where God tells Moses to tell the Israelites, do not bow down and worship the sun and the moon and all the host of heaven, meaning the heavenly army, the angelic realm, things that have been allotted to the nations for their gods. The nations were under the supervision of these other entities, but having been created with free will, they chose to rebel and accept worship themselves. And God, basically, that's the Old Testament story. From that point on, it's like the nations and their small g gods versus Israel and its God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because there is kind of like this running narrative in church, and I'm not sure why or where it came from, that the angel, the angel, I'm putting air quotes around it, Lucifer, fell, and then they never fell again, and the angels have always just been good guys since. And I don't know where that came from.
Yeah.
They are creatures of free will, present tense, creatures of free will. Yes, the Lucifer thing happened, but also we tend to always see one bad guy. There's one bad guy, and his name is Lucifer. He doesn't go by any other name. It's just Lucifer. And he's an angel, which I don't know where we get that either, because he's a cherub, which is not the same thing as an angel. And
Well,
never
maybe he's a cherub. We can talk about that.
I want to talk about that.
Okay.
Am I wrong?
Well, I think there is evidence that he is not, in fact, the cherub. Now, first of all, and this may be getting into the weeds a little bit. I wrote in The Second Coming of Saturn that I believe the entity who led the rebellion in Genesis chapter 6. And the reason I wrote that book was to try to trace the history of this entity, because it seemed like if this was such an important thing that God sent the flood to wipe out every living, breathing thing on earth except for Noah and his family. I mean, every land animal wiped out because of the flood, because of the corruption brought by this rebellion. What happened to the leader of that rebellion? We see the sons of God mentioned in 4 verses in Genesis 6, alluded to in 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude verses 6 and 7. And that's it. But I think he's woven through the Old Testament if we look into the Hebrew. I think this is the entity called Shemi-Yaza in the book of 1st Enoch. Now, bear in mind, that was written in that section, the Book of the Watchers, the first 36 chapters of 1st Enoch, probably written around 300 BC. So long after the events so was that his actual name? We don't know. It's possible that it was transmitted orally over the centuries, but we don't know that for sure. Where did he go after the flood of Noah in Genesis 9 and 10? What happened to him? I think this is the entity who was known to the Canaanites as El, to the Babylonians as Enlil, to the Akkadians as Ellil, to the Hurrians, I mentioned Kumarbi, the Romans, Saturn, the Greeks, Kronos, the Phoenicians, Baal-Hamon, the Amorites and Philistines, Dagon, to the Ammonites, the abomination of the Ammonites, Milcom, which makes him Molech of the Hebrews. When you piece together the evidence from ancient writers, that's the same entity under different names. The Assyrians called him Ashur, their chief deity. And you see references to this entity all through the Old Testament. Dagon is mentioned, obviously, in the story of the Philistines stealing the ark, and, of course, the story of Samson. The Philistines steal the ark. They put it in the temple of Dagon next morning. Dagon's idol is collapsed in front of it. The next morning he comes back, head removed, hands removed, which in the ancient world is what you did to your captured captives. You removed their hands. The Egyptians did this. This is how they would count how many enemies they'd killed. How many hands have we got? That was something that would have been understood 3,000 years ago. Oh, yeah, okay, so Dagon is subservient and he's been completely defeated. Molech, an underworld deity demanding the sacrifice of children. Dagon, who to the Amorites was known as Lord of the Corpse, or Lord of the Corpse Offering, or Lord of the Human Sacrifice. Kronos, Saturn, Baal-Hamon, all very well known in the classical world, into the Christian era, as demanding child sacrifice. The same entities again and again with the same principles. But even Enlil, who was the father god in the Mesopotamians, his temple, and this is true, the Hurrian form of this entity as well, his holy city was at Nippur, which is in what is now central Iraq. In Ezekiel chapter 1, that description of God's throne room, the wheels within wheels with the four living creatures, the cherubim around it, which, of course, the guy with the tall hair in the History Channel says is a UFO. It's not. It's a description of the throne room of God. But Ezekiel mentions 8 times in his book that he had that vision by the Kivar Canal. The vision I had at the first by the Kivar Canal. He keeps referring back to it throughout the book. Why? Because the Kivar Canal runs right through Nippur, right next to the temple of Enlil. In other words, God manifests directly over the temple of this entity who led the Genesis 6 rebellion, Shemiyaza/Enlil, and shows Ezekiel what's going to happen for the rest of history. And it's like, oh, and you can't do anything about it. It's beautiful. His main epithet was Great Mountain, okay? In fact, his temple, Enlil's temple, and when the Assyrians conquered Babylon, Ashur became the Assyrian form of Enlil. They renamed Ashur's temple E-Kur to match the temple in Nippur, means house of the mountain or mountain house. In Zechariah 4, we've all heard that Bible verse, not by power, but by my spirit, says God. The next verse, though, says, "Who are you, O great mountain?" Before Zerubbabel, who'd been tasked with Zechariah of going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple, you shall become a plain. Now, Israel at that point, the Israelites had just spent like 100 years in the heart of Babylon. They knew who the great mountain was. This was a direct slap in the face of this entity. There are many other references in the Old Testament there. Ashur, there's in fact a term that Isaiah uses to refer to worthless idols. It's how it's translated not just in Isaiah, but also in Psalms. The phrase worthless idols is Elilim, which is plural of Elil, the Akkadian form of Enlil. In other words, the minions of Enlil are these worthless idols, demonic minions. It's woven through the Bible. So this entity didn't disappear. Now, I believe that this is the entity that Isaiah was referring to in Isaiah 14. Lucifer in Hebrew is Halel, Halel ben Shakar, Lightbringer, son of dawn. A scholar named William R. Gallagher in 1990 wrote a paper showing that Halel is the West Semitic form, in other words, the Hebrew form of Elil. In other words, this was directed specifically at Enlil. When Origen, in the 4th century AD, translated Halel as Lightbringer, he put it into Latin as lux, meaning light, and pharos, meaning carrier, light bearer, light bringer. And Jerome, when he translated that into the Vulgate, he used Origen's translation, and that's why Lucifer made it into the King James translation. And so we've taken that as a proper name ever since. But it wasn't until about the 2nd century AD that any of the early church fathers connected Satan to Isaiah 14.
Right.
The apostles didn't see it that way. Jews have never saw it that way.
Right.
But I think Isaiah, understanding very well who Elil/Enlil/Ashur was. In fact, there's even a hidden reference to Dagon in Isaiah chapter 14 later on, where he talks about, you are cast away from the grave like a loathed corpse. Like, okay, Dagon, Lord of the corpse offering, These are backhanded insults at this chief deity of the pagans of Mesopotamia, the pagan father god of the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Phoenicians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians. This entity who thought he was all that, Isaiah mocking him and saying, okay, you who led that rebellion back there in the time of Moses, you are now in Sheol, where the shades, the Rephaim, the spirits of the Nephilim, The spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood say, hey, look at this. You're as weak as we are, with maggots for coverings and worms for your bed. Satan is never connected in the Old Testament. He is never connected to the netherworld. He's never connected to the Genesis 6 rebellion, never connected to the giants, the Nephilim. This entity in Isaiah 14 and the parallel chapter in Ezekiel 28 is. So that's why I say I believe that's Shemiyaza / Molech / Dagon / et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In Ezekiel 28, the verse that says, you were the guardian cherub who covers.
That's where I was hoping you'd go next, because I'm like, okay, I have no problem admitting that
Right.
Shemiyaza was the original bad guy, but
Right.
was he a cherub?
In Ezekiel 28, the verses that are translated, you were the guardian cherub who covers, the Septuagint translation, which was translated by Jewish religious scholars in the 3rd century BC. Okay, so they translated it from Hebrew texts available to them into Greek, 200 years before Jesus walked the earth. They translate that verse as, I placed you with the guardian cherub on the mountain of God.
That's okay. That just made a lot of stuff click.
Because otherwise, if you assume that Satan is that entity, and again, this explains it either way, okay? If Satan is a Nakash, which is a serpentine entity, and we see Nakash used interchangeably with seraph, the singular of seraphim, mentioned only in Isaiah 6, but you see it in Numbers 21, the fiery serpents that were biting the Israelites. It's seraphim nakashim. And scholars now pretty much agree that seraphim probably were serpentine in appearance. So how can you have a serpentine being a nakash also be a cherub, described by Ezekiel as this thing with the feet of calves and a human face and a lion's face and an oxen face and an eagle's face? They look nothing alike. Well, if he's placed with the cherub, the guardian cherub in Eden, whoever this rebel is, whether it's the Nakash or whether it's Shemiyaza, either way, you get the cherub as a separate entity altogether. And then the verse, about 3 verses later, where it says, the cherub ejected you from the mountain or threw you off the mountain of God. So I don't think the rebel in Eden described in Isaiah 14, Lucifer, is a cherub. I think he was thrown out of the garden by the cherub. And again, the cherubim and the seraphim also, throne guardians of God. Now, is Lucifer Satan? Yeah, the early church didn't think so. I don't think so. I know that this is so ingrained in the modern church today. When I've taught on this or brought it out in public, there are some people who push back and say, well, that's heresy. Well, heresy is teaching that there's another way to get to the Father other than Jesus Christ.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, that H word gets thrown around a little too loosely sometimes. But again, I think this entity, Shemiyaza, El, Dagon, Molech, Saturn, Kronos, etc., is really interesting, because the other thing that's fascinating about the Septuagint translation of Ezekiel 28 is that the English translations we have, based on the Masoretic text, which was completed around 900 AD, so more than 1,000 years after the Septuagint translation, which means, okay, you've got scribal changes and some tweaks. Our friend Doug Woodward, in his book, Rebooting the Bible, a 2-volume set, shows how the Septuagint preserves some things about the Old Testament that have been changed to de-emphasize the existence of other entities in the spirit realm, because Jews after the 2nd century, beginning in the 2nd century AD, were really getting kind of touchy, because Christians are saying, we know who the angel of the Lord is.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And there are other entities in the spirit realm. So in order to take away some of the evidence from the scriptures in the Old Testament, the Masoretic text has been tweaked in some places. It doesn't change any core Christian doctrines. Your Bible, I'm not saying your Bible is wrong. Your Old Testament is fine. But just understand that Jews of the time of Jesus and the apostles had a slightly different Old Testament than the one that we have. And in Ezekiel 28, the precious stones that were the covering of this rebel, there are more of them than there are in our Bible. We've got 9 in the covering of the rebel in Ezekiel 28. But in the Septuagint translation, there are 12, and it's the same 12 that are in the ephod of the high priest, which suggests that possibly this entity, Shemiyaza, was the high priest in Eden until he was thrown out for his rebellion.
Okay, wow.
I mean, yeah.
There's a lot of things I have heard you teach on, and all of them suddenly just went whoop. There they went. Because I mean, I get these little bits here and there. I've definitely heard the breakdown of Shemiyaza being the original bad guy. I forgot about the Hillel, though. That's very interesting.
Credit to our friend Doug Hamp for pointing that out to me. Doug shared that paper with me, and it's like, oh, okay. I've cited that in, I think, 3 books now because that is big.
No, it is. It's huge.
Yeah.
That is a huge missing element that makes a lot of this click. I've been studying this for a number of years, and it's funny how you can live your entire life studying this one specific topic and still miss a really, really tiny key element that's just lost in the throes of history. But as I have so many times seen, especially when it comes to whether or not women are able to preach or teach in the church today, there's those little key elements. And you're like, hang on a minute. If you go back to Origen, all of the church historians, we have to call them feminists.
Yeah.
If we're going to call the Junia, the female apostle in Romans 16, if we're going to call her just a girl that was known by the apostles, that's one of the examples that my audience is really familiar with right away, is the idea that one tiny little word, mistranslated, one tiny little word contextually left to the wayside, and here we are 2,000 years later, we are completely removed from the original context. Folks, here's the thing. It might be new, it might be even shocking to hear that these little g gods were real. Keep this in mind. First of all, we are going to have Derek back next week. We're not done with this conversation. That's the first thing to keep in mind. But the second thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to the Lord, ontology is the study of what a thing is, what a person is, the state of their being, their substance, their essence, what makes them who and what they are. Ontologically speaking and theologically speaking, there is one capital G God. Don't be threatened by Elohim as a plural. They were not God in any ontological aspect. That you can take to the bank. You can rest your faith on that. There is one creator God. The Bible is not vague on that. We will be back. Stick with us next week.